Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another week lesson that we're going to work through together. And hopefully, at this point, that you're starting to kind of work through the end of the unit and getting to the final end of the unit assessment. And been working on your portfolio problems. This lesson is entitled "Proportional Relationships, Part 4." So as you notice, we've been kind of working through some different things with proportional relationships. We've been looking at data on tables. Do two tables have a relationship? We looked at equations. We looked at all sorts of different things with this idea of proportional relationships. So we're going to kind of wrap up this idea by looking at graphs. Can we look at graphs and determine the information on that graph is a proportional relationship without putting it into a table? So your learning target this week is I can analyze different graphs to determine if they have a proportional relationship. So your engage section kind of starts you out thinking to yourself, if I look at this graph, is there a proportional relationship? Is everything on that graph to me, and again, this is a gauge, so this is kind of like, what do you know, maybe using some prior knowledge from the year before, or your understanding of proportional relationships with graphs, determine or just kind of put down your thoughts, what do you think about this graph, and then kind of explain your process a little bit, like why do you think it does or why not, because as you move through the explore, explain, evaluate, and lesson sections, you may kind of reinforce something that you already know, or you may find out some new things as well. And don't be afraid to ask yourself some questions with that. What does make it proportional, or what are some things I need to look for if I don't know? And as we move through this explore section, there's a video there for you on how to identify proportional relationships from graphs. So it's an additional resource for you to watch. So if you could watch that and kind of write down some examples from there on how to determine, because that's going to help you more if you're diving into the resources that are offered for you. We're going to do the read section together. We're going to kind of look at some things there together, and then again, the do is kind of practice some of those problems that you've already kind of researched a little bit through the watch and the read sections. But through this read section, I kind of wanted to pinpoint a couple things with this graph. Okay, so I kind of want to look at it and kind of be able to determine together what are some things that we could be looking for in this section. And as I get my pen ready here, I'm going to kind of move this over a little bit so you can see it. Okay, so if we look at this idea here, if I'm given a graph, okay, so this graph is all about distance in miles and time in hours, all right? So if I look there, they gave you a table of information, but sometimes we're not going to have that table. We got to be able to look at the graph and understand if it has a proportional relationship. And there's two things that we kind of got to zero in on, all right? The first thing is that it needs to start at its origin, all right? So if I look at the origin, all right, the starting point, all right, if my time is 0, then my distance should also be 0. If I see a 0, 0, I know that I'm starting at my origin, and that's kind of the starting point to a proportional relationship. Again, you can't go 20 miles in 0 hours, right? It's just not possible. So if that's the case, then we would say there's no proportional relationship, because we're starting at a time in miles that there are no time, and it just doesn't make any sense. So we have to start at the origin of a graph. That's the first thing we need to recognize. Is it starting at the origin? Is it starting at 0, 0? So if I go 0 miles, I go 0 miles in 0 hours. The second thing we need to realize is there slope? Is the slope the same from given points on the graph? And if you notice this, the table sort of already gave you some points, but if we don't have the table, what we can see is that we have a point of 130, again, which is on the table, but if we don't have that, we're going to kind of look for ourselves. A second point we could watch is 2 and 60, okay? So 260. So do these 2 points form a proportional relationship? And again, we've already talked about what proportions are and how to solve proportions. And when we do that, that tells us if those 2 points have a proportional relationship, which is going to make the other points on that line the same thing. All right, so if I were to equal these two and cross multiply, 60 times 1 is 60, 2 times 30 is also 60, so that displays a proportional relationship. The other thing I can say is, which this idea of giving 2 points to see a relationship, is the idea of slope. Is the slope the same from point to point? And in this case, if we look at the graph, and I can't really write on it, but if we look at 1 to 30 where the dot line meets the middle there, if we go up 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, all right, and we apply that to the next line, which is 390, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the slope is part of that proportional relationship between 2 points. Is the slope from one point to the next the same as well, which again, if we're using this idea, it's going to make the slope the same. All right, is it increasing by the same slope? So there's two things we got to remember here. Is it starting at the origin, and is the slope the same from point to point? Or another way to say it is, are the 2 points form a proportional relationship if I solve those two? So as you're working through this unit, I want you to think of those two things and use that understanding as you move through each section of this lesson and the other checkpoints involved. The explain, again, how does a graph help us find proportional relationships? So this is kind of reiterating the two things that I just shared, so that you're able to remember them as you move through the rest of this unit. And with the evaluate, like everything, I would like for you to complete the which are not proportional in the unit, the checkpoint, which should be right after this. So if you complete that, that'll give you some kind of practice, a check for understanding on what you kind of went through in the explore and the explain sections. And then in the elaborate section, I have a document that has you analyzing a graph, which refers back to our learning target. I can analyze different graphs to find proportional relationships. And you're going to tell me, does that graph display a proportional relationship or not? And there's some questions that are going to be asked. And if you notice throughout some of our other assignments as well, we've used these kind of, I call them literacy questions. These explain, like number 3 here says, what do you think the proportional relationship of this graph can tell me about the distance my height is related to my time? So again, it's using your understanding of proportional relationships in graphs to kind of further your thinking a little bit. It's kind of a good literacy skill to have in explaining, again, the process for which you found. So if you can kind of see this activity, again, it's a way for you to elaborate on what you just learned. And then to wrap everything up, the express. What did or do you find frustrating about it or about this lesson? Again, reflecting on this lesson and how you operate through it is a good way to identify the skills that you need work on and the skills that you're good at to move through the rest of the units and through the rest of the year as well. So hopefully at the end of this lesson, you can confidently say, I can analyze different graphs to determine if they have a proportional relationship. And again, use this lesson to enhance your learning as you move through the checkpoints towards the end of this unit. Have a great week.